Hi, everybody. We're here today to offer some comments on our selections from Plato's Republic. We've chosen portions of that book amounting to probably about 50 pages, trying to highlight the most well known portions of the text and portions that will enable us to engage most effectively with Plato's ideas. So today we'll look at each of those portions and just try and put them in context of the work as a whole. So as you read them, you'll understand better what you're reading. Let's get started. So Plato's Republic is certainly his best known work, the work for which he's most famous, and by far the longest work. It is an expansive text. Its main question, what is justice, is addressed fairly early on. It becomes, after that, once that question is answered, an exploration of this ideal city. So, hence, we have a city here. Plato is using this project of describing a city as a way of identifying what justice is, and then ultimately of reflecting on the role of the philosopher in that city. What is his or her place? Why do people react to him or her as they do? So let's have a look at a little orientation here first. The opening pages of the dialogue that you have describe Socrates in the very first line going down to the Piraeus. So the Piraeus was a place outside of the city of Athens, significantly outside of the city walls. It was still connected with Athens, but it was the port, right? And so for Socrates to go down there, what does it mean? It means he's leaving his everyday role in the city, his usual environs. He's going down with Polemarchus and Glaucon and Adeimantus and the different characters in the dialogue, and the dialogue will occur outside of the city. So that's significant because he's not doing, asking questions that one usually would ask. He's asking more fundamental questions, and for that purpose has to actually leave the city. Now, the first selection that you have after that little introduction is the really famous one from Book One of the Republic. And here you'll see I've put the headings that match the headings in your selections, as well as a reference to those numbers, the Stephanus numbers, in the margins of the text, so you'll know where we are. Here we have a sketch from a talented artist of this character Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a beast. That's the term we can use. He's a sophist. He's a powerful arguer, orator, rhetorician, right? He bursts onto the scene as if he would attack. So take note of how he's depicted, right? This reflects the style of his argument as well. And what is his argument? Justice is the advantage of the strong. Put in simpler words, might makes right, right? What we call justice is just what the powerful want to say justice is. It's what serves their own interests. That's Thrasymachus's argument. Now, of course, we might think initially, well, I don't believe that might makes right. But if we think about it, I mean, Thrasymachus is describing how things actually are often, right? That's a descriptive claim. Yes, often the powerful have their way. Of course, Socrates wants to go beyond the descriptive. He wants to ask the question, is it actually right? And this is the same thing he did with piety in the Euthyphro, the same thing he does in all of his dialogues. He starts from, what people happen to say about the topic and moves on to ask more fundamental questions. So he does that in Book One of the Republic. Here he points out, right, sometimes the strong rulers, right, they make mistakes. And so if they make a mistake, what if they do something that doesn't match their own interest, right? It's a little similar to the Euthyphro argument. Is something just because the ruler does it, or does the ruler do it because it's just? Okay. The point here is that it's not adequate to say that the ruler simply does whatever the ruler wants to do, and you can call that justice. Socrates develops this by using the example of the doctor or the ship's captain, right? these people, if they're good at what they do what they do for the benefit of the patient or of the ship. They don't do it just to get their salary, right? I mean, if you had a doctor or a captain and she's like, "Hey, I'm just here to collect my paycheck," right? You'd say, "Well, that's not a characteristic of a good doctor or captain," right? I mean, maybe that person is a wage earner and she is good at earning her wages, but she's not good at being a doctor or a captain. So, as Socrates puts it, no craft or rule provides for its own advantage, but as we've been saying for some time, it provides and orders for its subject and aims at its advantage, that of the weaker, not of the stronger. So, for a ruler to be a ruler, if we're going to call what that ruler does just, it has to be done for the advantage of those whom Socrates here calls the weaker, right? To the subjects of that ruler, and not simply to the benefit of that ruler, him or herself. So, in short, Thrasymachus storms out at the end of Book One. And in Book One of the Republic, we pretty much have a Socratic dialogue. It's kind of self-contained. You could call it the Thrasymachus, right? So Socrates engages with Thrasymachus about justice. But then at the beginning of Book Two, we begin a different project, and that's what opens things up. The next passage you have is called the Ring of Gyges, and here Socrates is recounting a story that will have been familiar and is related to this question of justice, because Glaucon and Adeimantus are not satisfied, or both Plato's brothers, by the way. It's kind of an interesting inclusion. Glaucon and Adeimantus are not satisfied, that Socrates has fully described the nature of justice, and so they want more. Okay, well, they start by looking at this case of the Ring of Gyges. Gyges is a person, right? And I've included here a picture of the ring from The Lord of the Rings, because J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of that, really based his notion of this invisibility ring on this passage from Plato's Republic. Oh, the more you know. Quote from the dialogue. Gyges experimented with the ring. If he turned the setting inward, he became invisible. If he turned it outward, he became visible again. When he realized this, he at once arranged to become one of the messengers sent to report to the king. And when he arrived there, he seduced the king's wife, attacked the king with her help, killed him, and took over the kingdom. Okay, so here he is, Gyges, right, using this ring to do what we would call injustice, right? And as you'll see in the passage, and there's some discussion, well, what if a just person wears the ring? What if an unjust person wears the ring? It's a helpfully concrete example, this ring, which is why we've included it. But the question ultimately posed, and the one that you've been invited to reflect upon in your reflection this week, is what is more valuable, actually being just or just having a reputation for being just, right? The question is, nice guys finish last. Okay, so if you're actually just, yeah, you're just. That's good for you, right? But you might not win the game. You might not end up being rich and famous or powerful. But, what Socrates wants to maintain, of course, and what philosophy in general hopes to maintain, is that justice is actually for your good and the good of others, and will end up good, right? That injustice will actually leave you worse off. And so, therefore, it's not enough to simply have people think that you're just and get all the benefits of that reputation. Ultimately, you have to actually be just, or at least that's the aim or the hope. So, the book is defined by this project of founding a city. And it's described as an effort to, okay, so they want to figure out what is it to be just for an individual person. And Socrates says, I've got an idea for you. What does he say? Since we aren't clever people, we should adopt the method of investigation that we use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to read small letters from a distance, and then notice that the same letters existed elsewhere in a larger size and on a larger surface. We'd consider it a godsend, I think, to be allowed to read the larger ones first and then to examine the smaller ones to see whether they really are the same. So, what's he talking about here? The small letters are justice in the individual soul, right? So what is it for me or for you to be just? And Socrates is saying this is like the small letters from a distance. Let's blow that up a bit, hence the magnifying glass, right? Let's blow that up and look at how justice works in a city, which is a lot bigger than an individual person, and then kind of read that back into the individual case, and we'll have our answer. Right? So, as he puts it, let's first find out what sort of thing justice is in a city, and afterward look for it in the individual, observing the ways in which the smaller is similar to the larger. We'll have a lot to say about this, but this is pretty much the premise of the book, right? Once you get past the first book, book one, the Thrasymachus, that you move into the bigger project, which is all based on mapping out this city. So now, what happens we talked last time about Plato and the three parts of the soul. Remember the chariot, right? So you have reason in the chariot itself, and then you have spiritedness, kind of, energy, and desire or appetite, right? And those are the two horses. And so reason is driving the two horses. Great. What Plato is going to say is that those three parts of the soul correspond with the three classes of persons in his imagined city, right? So the three classes of persons are the guardians, who correspond with reason, and we'll have a little chart we'll put up about this in a minute. So the guardians correspond with reason, the auxiliaries, or the soldiers, which correspond with spirit, right? And then the craftsmen, which correspond, with appetite, right, with desire. And so the city needs to have all three of these people, now types of people. Now the problem is, how are you going to convince the appetite people, the craftsmen, right, that they are truly craftsmen and they shouldn't try to be guardians or to be soldiers, right? How are you going to convince the soldiers that they're supposed to be soldiers and not guardians? Okay, the question is posed. How then could we devise one noble falsehood, the noble lie, right, that would, in the best case, persuade even the rulers? But if that's not possible, then the others in the city. Persuade them of what? To remain in their role, right? Because if everybody starts trying to change roles, you're going to have some chaos in the city, as we'll see. All of you in the city are brothers. So this is the lie. This is what Socrates is going to say to people who ask, right? Or to all the people in the city. All of you in the city are brothers, we'll say. But the God who made you guardians mixed some gold, into you who are adequately equipped to rule, because they, the guardians, are most valuable. He put silver in those who are auxiliaries, and iron and bronze in the farmers and other craftsmen. So what's the lie? You are who you are by nature. The God put a certain kind of metal in your soul. So if you're a bronze person, don't try and be a gold person, right? If you're a gold person, don't try and be a bronze person. Now, he goes into some more detail about this. I mean, sometimes two gold people might have a bronze child, or two bronze people might have a gold child. But what's the moral of the story here, right? It leads us to wonder, at least it seems to me, what are we told in our societies, in the United States today, but in any society? What kinds of noble lies are we willing to tell others, or are we told ourselves about our social position, that's maybe meant to maintain harmony, but is not ultimately true, as is the case of this story? So a few little passages here about the parts of the city. So as we said, there are these three parts, and Socrates links this with the parts of the soul. So in the soul of that very person, there is a better part and a worse one, and that whenever the naturally better part is in control of the worse, this is expressed by saying that the person is self-controlled or master of himself, right? So the better part here would be those guardians corresponding with reason, right? And the less rational part would be the two horses, the spirited horse and the horse of appetite. What we found, he says a little later on, at least from the point of view of our present beliefs, 3 out of the 4 virtues of our city: wisdom, courage, and moderation. So what kind of virtue is left then that makes the city share even further in virtue surely it's clear that it's justice. Okay, we're coming up on justice here, right? What are there are four traditional virtues in Greek society: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. So the four, right? So wisdom corresponds with reason or the guardians. Courage corresponds with the soldiers or the spiritedness. Moderation corresponds with the craftsman or appetite, right? And where's justice? Because we only have three classes, but there are four virtues. So what he comes to, and this is his definition of justice, fairly early on in the dialogue, as we said, justice, I think, he says, is exactly what we said must be established throughout the city when we were founding it. Either that or some form of it. We stated, and often repeated if you remember, that everyone must practice one of the occupations in the city for which he is naturally best suited. Then it turns out that doing one's own work is justice. So justice is not what the guardians do or what the soldiers do or what the craftsmen do. Justice is that all of these different parts of the city should exist in harmony with each other. We have a little table on this. Thank you to the person who created this table. So we have our three parts of the city: the rulers, the auxiliaries, and what are called here the producers or the craftsmen, right? Each of these, as we said, corresponds with one of the three virtues: wisdom, courage, and moderation. And these in turn correspond to the three parts of the soul that we've seen. And justice, then, that's why it's the heading of this, right, is when all of these parts of the city, all of these virtues, and all of these parts of the soul fit together, work together in harmony, right? You don't have appetite encroaching on reason. I want 10 pieces of cake. No, you don't. That kind of conflict leads to disharmony in the soul. But in the city, Plato says it leads to injustice. And here's a last passage on that topic. Injustice, he says, must be a kind of civil war between the three parts, right? A meddling and doing of another's work, a rebellion by some part against the whole soul in order to rule it inappropriately. The rebellious part is by nature suited to be a slave, while the other part is not a slave but belongs to the ruling class. Mixing in some social language here. We'll say something like that, I suppose, and that the turmoil and straying of these parts are injustice, licentiousness, cowardice, ignorance, in a word, the whole of vice, right? So, practical example. I got to get up in the morning. I don't want to get up. My appetite to stay in bed is encroaching on my reason, which knows I have to get up, right? And so, in that case, you have a rebellion of your desire, against your reason. And this creates disharmony in the soul, and it creates disharmony also in the city. So now we're going to wrap up in the last few minutes here with looking at some of the philosophical passages, the role of the philosopher, right? This is really where the dialogue goes after basically settling the question of justice kind of midway through. So in the discussion of knowledge and opinion under that heading, we read this. So I draw this distinction, Socrates says. On one side are lovers of sights, crafts, practical people, right? On the other side are those we are arguing about and whom one would alone call philosophers, the lovers of sights and sounds, like beautiful sounds, colors, shapes, and everything fashioned out of them. But their thought is unable to see and embrace the nature of the beautiful itself. In fact, there are very few people who would be able to reach the beautiful itself and see it by itself. So remember the forms. We talked about this last week, right? There are lots of beautiful things. Appreciate them. They're a gift, right? But all of them, for Plato, participate in something higher than and beyond themselves. That is, the form of the beautiful, or ultimately the form of the good, right? Now, many people, he thinks, simply don't care about that higher level, right? They're not interested in the form of beauty. They're interested in the beautiful things. These are the lovers of sights, who like beautiful sounds, colors, shapes, and so on. This is the vast majority of people. But a very few, he thinks, is able to see that form, and those people are the philosophers. Now, he also identifies here this relationship between knowledge and ignorance and opinion, and tries to place different claims we make on that spectrum, right? So, as knowledge is set over what is, while ignorance is set over what is not, we must find an intermediate, he thinks, between knowledge and ignorance to be set over what is intermediate between what is and what is not. Intermediate thing, he says, is opinion, right? So if you're talking about philosophy and you're reaching kind of definite conclusions about things, that is knowledge, right? If you simply don't know what you're talking about, that is ignorance. Right? But if you're dealing with these sites, right, material things that correspond to those ideas, that's the domain of opinion, right? Because those things that exist don't simply exist completely like the forms themselves. They clearly don't not exist. I mean, you can see them, right? But we have opinions about those things, even though we also we hopefully have knowledge about the forms of those things. So I think we have a table here. Right. This is a passage, an important passage in this section. It's kind of complex, so we didn't include it. But this table helpfully outlines Plato's distinction between opinion and what's listed here as intellect, or what we can call knowledge, right? So uh, all of reality is divided into these two. And keep in mind here what we discussed last week about this. So the physical world of the senses, right? This is a space of opinion. About material things that you see in your life, you form opinions, right? This has to do with conjecture, like, I'm not sure, I guess I'm going to make a educated guess, right? So that's the most shadowy, kind of murky belief you can hold. And then proper belief, right, about physical objects. So this is what we do in the natural sciences. We observe things, and then we develop hypotheses, we test them, we develop theories. This is not to say that all theories are simply opinion, but science is always provisional and changing and developing, and our scientific knowledge of the physical world is hopefully becoming more and more accurate. For Plato, though, beyond that, right, is the invisible world of reason. And this corresponds with your intellect. It covers mathematics, and it also covers for Plato this ability of philosophers and of what scientific knowledge aims at, the ideal forms, right? So when we define the law of gravity, right, or other kind of constants in nature, for Plato, we are, insofar as these are accurate measurements, seeing a deep structure of things that you can't see with your eyes, but you can know is the case in any given situation. Okay, a couple little implications of this, right? So you have this philosopher, and she is able to see the forms. She has knowledge, right? Too bad, though, she's living amidst all of these people who have merely opinion, right? And we have the famous passage here, which I'll read out quickly for us, but I encourage you to read carefully in the selection about the simile of the ship, or it is the simile of the ship. Let's hear it. There is the ship owner, larger and stronger than everyone on the ship, but somewhat deaf and rather short-sighted, with a knowledge of sailing to match his eyesight. So the ship owner doesn't know what he's doing. The sailors are quarreling among themselves over captaincy of the ship. Who should be captain? Each one thinking that he ought to be captain, though he never learned that skill. On top of which they say it can't be taught. You can't even learn to be a proper captain. In fact, they're prepared to cut to pieces anyone who says it can be taught. They beg him, the ship owner, to do everything they can to make him hand over the tiller to them, to give them control of the ship. Sometimes, if other people can persuade him, and they can't, they kill those others and throw them overboard. Then they immobilize their worthy ship owner with drugs or drinks or by some other means and take control of the ship, helping themselves to what it is carrying. Drinking and feasting, they sail in the way you expect people like that to sail. If someone is good at finding them ways of persuading or compelling the ship owner to let them take control, they call him a real seaman, a real captain. They say he really knows about ships. So what's happened here? You've got a kind of, dull-witted ship owner, and then all of these sailors, and none of them are referring to actually how to run a ship, right? They think that the good captain is the person who can get power from the ship owner, right? Who can convince the ship owner that he, this sailor, should be in charge. None of them are actually guiding the ship, though, and none of them know what they're doing. In fact, they insist you can't know what you're doing, right? There's nothing to know. Uh, in a way, here we have an image of our modern political world, right? Everybody wants to get power, Plato would say, but none of them actually know what to do when they get it. None of them is the true navigator or captain. He includes, though, after that, another passage. These sailors have never seriously considered that the true pilot, the true navigator, must pay attention to the year and seasons and sky and stars and winds and whatever else belongs to his art, if he intends to be really qualified for command of the ship. He must and will be the steerer, whether other people like or not the possibility of this union of authority with the steerer's art. Now, in vessels which are in a state of mutiny and by sailors who are mutineers, how will such a true pilot be regarded? Will he not be called by them a prater, a stargazer, a good for nothing? If the culture on the ship is might makes right, right? I'm good at getting power and therefore I'm in charge, right? They're going to look at a person who's, looking at the sky, trying to navigate the ship as wasting her time. Why are you wasting your time with that? You got to just focus on getting power, right? This is the position of the philosopher in the city, according to Plato. No one listens to the philosopher, and as we saw, they are willing even to kill Socrates, historically. One other passage here before our last one on the cave. This is on the beast. So here again we have an example of people, this would correspond with the sophists, right? People who are trying just to achieve a certain outcome without caring whether it's true or without caring about the nature of what they're dealing with, right? So it's as if someone were learning the moods and appetites of a huge, strong beast that he's rearing, an animal, right? How to approach it and handle it, when it is most difficult to deal with or most gentle, and what makes it so, what sounds it utters in either condition, what sounds soothe or anger it. Having learned all this through tending the beast over a period of time, he calls this knack wisdom, gathers his information together as if it were a craft, and starts to teach it. In truth, he knows nothing about which of these convictions is fine or shameful, good or bad, just or unjust. He applies all these names in accordance with how the beast reacts, calling what it enjoys good, calling what angers it bad. He has no other account to give of these terms. And he calls what he is compelled to do just and fine, for he hasn't seen and cannot show anyone else how much compulsion or goodness really differ. Don't you think, by God, that someone like this is a strange educator? Right? What are the contrast cases here? Go back to Socrates and the sophists, right? Socrates is saying, I'm interested in the form of the good. I want to know, the nature of the beast. I want to know what is good and bad, what is just and unjust. And then having that knowledge, I, the philosopher, will apply that knowledge, right? And then I will teach you that knowledge, and then you will apply that knowledge. Socrates. Contrast case, the sophists. All they want to do is achieve a certain outcome, make the beast happy, right? The beast here, the large animal, refers to the political society, say the assembly, right? Or the jury at a trial. It doesn't matter if he did it or didn't do it, right? What matters is you can win the case, right? So let's observe what the jury wants, observe what the assembly wants, and give them what they want to achieve that outcome. Socrates is saying, if you don't have philosophers in charge, basically, right? Like if you don't combine authority with the steering of knowledge of the steering of the ship, you're going to end up with a result like this. And Plato certainly thought that's the result they'd come to. So moving toward the allegory of the cave, which is our concluding point here, and we'll wrap up on that. Plato introduces what he calls the offspring of the good. So the whole dialogue is tending now. So we've gone through justice, we've looked at the position of the philosopher. Who is the philosopher? Now, what is the philosopher doing, right? Well, the philosopher is trying to see the form of the good, right? Not just give the beast what it wants, not just get control of the ship, but navigate properly, right? Tend to the animal according to its nature to bring out what is truly good for it, not just what it wants. Um, as Plato writes here about this form of the good, um, understand the soul. We can understand the soul in the same way as this form of the good. When the soul focuses on something illuminated by truth and what is, it understands, knows, and apparently possesses understanding. But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity, on what comes to be and passes away, it opines, is dimmed, changes its opinions this way and that, seems bereft of understanding, right? So when you have the form of the good, when you as the philosopher have seen that, and you're able to identify what is good in different cases, right? Then you apparently possess understanding. We call that knowledge. Right? If you've never seen the form of the good, you've never engaged in philosophy, you've never done this, then you're only going to give your opinion, right? You're in the position of the sailor, or the keeper of that beast. You don't really have knowledge. You're just kind of responding to what's happening around you. And Plato thinks that the philosopher has to see this form of the good. Um, this table presents the relationship between the son, which is called the offspring of the good, and the good itself. The offspring here means kind of a visual version of the good, because you can't see the good with your physical eyes, but you can see the sun, right? So just as the sun illuminates the visible world, and everything we see is lit by the sun, so the form of the good illuminates the world of ideas and forms. And he, maps out, as you can see on the table here, and in the interest of time, I won't walk through all of it. He maps out how you can move from first being concerned with kind of shadows of images, all the way up to contemplating the real form of things. And those who are able to do that, Socrates thinks, should be in charge of the city, just as reason should be in charge of the soul. So here's our last passage here on the allegory of the cave. This is certainly the best known passage in the Republic, and I encourage you to read it closely. I've given you just kind of the main portion of it. It begins as follows. Compare the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with their necks and their legs fettered, able to see only in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their head around. Light is provided by a fire burning above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there is a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path a low wall has been built, like a screen in front of puppeteers, above which they show their puppets. Right? So here we have a little image. Thank you to the producer of this image. We have our prisoners. They are facing a wall. There is a roadway, as it's called here, right? People are walking along that, carrying objects. And those objects cast a shadow on the wall, right, with the light behind them. However, there's also an exit going up out of the cave. And that's going to be the crux of the story, of course, because these prisoners don't know there's an exit. All they have ever seen is the shadows, right? But imagine this. If someone drags one of the prisoners away from there by force, up the rough, steep path, remember this is education, right? Up the rough, steep path, and didn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? And when he came into the light with the sun filling his eyes, wouldn't he be unable to see a single one of the things now said to be true? If this man went down into the cave again and sat down in his same seat, wouldn't his eyes, coming suddenly out of the sun like that, be filled with darkness? What is education? You live in a world of shadows. visible things. Someone takes you, frees you, drags you up, and you keep saying, "What's this? This doesn't make any sense. I don't want to do this. I want to go back," right? Okay. Drags you up into the sunlight. What is the sun? It's the offspring of the good, right? This is the world of forms. You're taken out of that world of shadows, you're put into this world of forms. And suddenly you're like, "Oh, wow. Now I see," right? I recognize that all the objects I thought were real are not real, right? They're actually just shadows of the real thing. And when you go back, the philosopher goes back, tries to tell people, "Hey, did you know this world you see isn't really what you think it is?" People don't take you seriously. They say you're crazy, right? There's nothing up there. Um, this is the plight of the philosopher. This is why Socrates got killed, right? And this is the image at the climax of Plato's book, in which he describes this account of the city where the philosophers will rule because they have seen this form of the good. Whew, that's a lot to cover. So, what do we have here, friends? We have the Republic. It starts with this book one, just kind of a story about what is justice, standard Socratic dialogue, and then opens up into this reflection of many kinds, right, on politics, society, place of philosophy in society, and lots of other themes too that we haven't been able to talk about in our brief treatment of it. But I hope you enjoy these passages. I hope you enjoy writing about them, especially. And we'll turn next week to our next author, who is the student of Plato, namely Aristotle.